panelist, Mr. Shawn Steil. Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Steil.
Steil, okay. Executive Director of Greater China Political and Coordination. That's what I have here. Is that your correct title? From Global Affairs Canada.
Yes, Policy and Coordination.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank
yes. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be before the committee. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee.
I'm pleased to appear before you to update you on the situation in Tibet and of Canada's recent engagements in this area.
By time,
Comme nous avons peu de temps, je serai bref afin de pouvoir répondre au plus grand nombre de questions possibles.
First of all, let me begin with a few remarks about the importance of human rights in Canada's relationship with China more broadly. The promotion and protection of human rights is an integral part of Canadian foreign policy and is a priority in our government's engagement with China.
and protection of human rights is an integral part of Canadian foreign policy and is a priority in our government's engagement with China. Our engagement on human rights is multifaceted and encompasses activities that range from high-level visits to public statements and more quiet advocacy in both bilateral and multilateral fora. Throughout the course of our bilateral interactions, Canada has consistently called on the Chinese government to respect the fundamental freedoms of all Chinese citizens. À de nombreuses reprises,
On numerous occasions, we have reminded the government of China that its ongoing persecution of religious and ethnic minorities, including in Tibet, is not only incompatible with its international obligations, but also its own constitution.
Canada remains deeply concerned about the human rights situation affecting Tibetans, which include the protection of linguistic and cultural rights. The detention and sentencing of Mr. Tasho Wangchuk, an ethnic Tibetan businessman from Qinghai province, to 5 years in prison in May 2018 for his simple advocacy of Tibetan linguistic and cultural rights as permitted under Chinese law, is but one example of the recent troubling developments concerning the human rights situation in China. In this particular case, we have not only appealed to the government of China for Mr. Wangchuk's unconditional release, but have also endorsed a public statement by United Nations experts calling for charges against Mr. Wangchuk to be dropped. Dans le cadre de nos
As part of our broader human rights engagement with China, Canada's concerns have been conveyed to Chinese authorities at the highest levels.
all of the venues and occasions in which we've raised the human rights situation, but we have mainstreamed this kind of advocacy at the highest levels with China. On the multilateral front, Canada co-sponsored a statement at the 2018 ministerial meeting to advance religious freedom in Washington, D.C., that called on the Chinese government to respect the rights of all individuals. In that statement, we noted the severe repression faced by religious minority groups such as Tibetan Buddhists in China. These efforts were followed up by our subsequent public recommendations to China on human rights as part of our Universal Periodic Review at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva in November 2018. At that time, Canada recommended that China end persecutions on the basis of religion or belief, including for Tibetan Buddhists.
In conclusion, I must note that the human rights situation in China, including in Tibet, remains a source of unabating concern for Canada.
To raise the responsibilities of the Chinese government to protect human rights, advise them of our preoccupations, and continue to urge the Chinese government to respect their own laws as well as their international obligations each time that we have the opportunity. And perhaps I could just close with one more point that was mentioned earlier about access. We continue to demand access for Canadian diplomats and journalists to Tibet. Unfortunately, the last time that we've had a senior level official visit Tibet was in 2015. Despite that, we continue to urge the Chinese authorities to allow a visit that is unfettered and unhindered so that we can better understand the real situation in Tibet. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Steil. I'll turn to Senator No, followed by Senator Dean.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Steil, thank you for coming. Minister Freeland's statement on Canada positions on advocating dialogue between the Chinese government and the Dalai Lama or his representative. Could you tell us if any concrete measure have been taken toward this end?
Thank you for the question. Indeed, it has been our consistent policy to advocate for dialogue so that the grievances, legitimate grievances in Tibet can be addressed. On concrete steps toward that direction, we've seen none on the part of the Chinese government. In fact, where in the past policy papers have indicated some openness with rather severe conditions for dialogue with the Tibetan authorities, including the Dalai Lama. In the most recent white paper that China released on Tibet on the 60th anniversary of the Dalai Lama's entry into exile, there was no longer any mention of that openness. So in fact, despite our continued advocacy for dialogue, there's appearing to be less enthusiasm for that on the part of China.
You want me to can I have a second question, sir? Oh, I can wait. I can go second round. That's all right.
So we'll turn to Senator Dean.
Mr. Steil, for being here today and for this report on Canada's advocacy and efforts to improve human rights in China and beyond. It is clear, I think, that Canada's a leader internationally in these efforts, certainly one of the leaders, particularly at a time when the relationship between these two countries is delicate, to say the least. We heard earlier a call for greater alignment across government programs and thinking. You work in the area of policy coordination. I note something that I'm a big fan of. Could you tell us a little bit about the way that these policies are coordinated across departments?
Sure. I mean, my domain of responsibility is foreign policy primarily, but you've rightly pointed out that my job title, which is a rather new unit within Global Affairs Canada, does take on some responsibility for coordination of policy. And I think that's in part a recognition that, as my colleague Alex Nev has highlighted, with questions concerning our relations with China and our advocacy on China, it requires a multifaceted, coordinated approach. These are early days in that mandate, but I can tell you that I've been working on and in China for a long time, and I've seen us move over the last decade to a much more coordinated approach in terms of the kinds of conversations we have around town, and even more broadly with Canadians. So where you may have seen more siloed discussions about issues such as economy and security, you're now seeing one conversation. With many points of view, of course, but one conversation. So much of my time is involved with coordinating those discussions on any number of issues. If I could comment on Mr. Nev's recommendation on better coherence on things like foreign influence and interference, that's a particularly broad area that requires leadership from not only the global affairs, foreign policy side of the shop, but many others. But it's I can say those are conversations that we have at an increasing rate.
Thank you for crossing boundaries.
Thank you, Senator Massicotte.
Thank you, sir, for being with us this morning. Let me ask you the big question that I have is, from my perception, with the election of Mr. Trump, the United States there seemed to be a vacuum worldwide for worldwide leadership, and against all the institutions, the World Bank, NATO, WTO, and so on and so on. And it would appear that the Chinese people had sort of come forth and saying, we're going to be contributing to this leadership and trying to entice European support and so on, as if they're the good guys. But more recently, the last 6 or 9 months, we've saw it looks like we went back 10 years where China's exercising or exhorting his muscular, economic, political, and military interests to sort of take a stronger position. How do you read that? Is that 2 years ago, was that only a camouflage of real intentions, and now we're dealing with the real China? Could you help us out there?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, on the U.S. position, I would start by pointing out that my American colleagues are very quick to underline that there's bipartisan support for the approach that the U.S. is adopting to China. What's instigated that would be, I suppose, a matter for debate or speculation, but it's probably in part instigated by China's own policies and approaches. Under Xi Jinping, it's become clear, and he's been quite vocal through policy statements and quite frank, that China is adopting a different model of government, rejecting the Western model of democracy, and putting at the center of that model the Communist Party of China. So that policy, whether it's the Made in China 2025 policy or other less well-known policies, has reinforced the notion that the Communist Party should be involved in many aspects of Chinese life. You know, one example where there's been some expression of concern is the establishment of party cells within state-owned companies. There have been concerns raised about, well, how does that work in joint ventures where there's foreign investment or in foreign companies? And so many are watching that carefully to see how it manifests itself. I think the jury's out on what kind of role these party cells might play within the parties. It may vary, but certainly those kinds of examples of where the party is very explicitly asserting for itself a larger role in day-to-day life, commercial affairs, in the judiciary, as well as in more harsh manners in places like Tibet, is a cause for concern, and I think is probably part of the reason that there's a bipartisan effort in the United States to push back on that.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Bean, to conclude. Oh, I have a second round question, so it'll be Senator Bean to conclude the first round.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to follow up on Senator Massicott's question, Mr. Steil. And you know, in my experience, we would always get together at international gatherings with the like-minded, if it was on a resolution or an initiative or something like that. And we always knew who the like-minded were, and it's becoming a little less clear now. And I'm just going to ask you, on the basis of your experience, and I know you've been a head of mission in the Asian area, like-minded countries in dealing with human rights issues, and particularly in China, are becoming more difficult to find in Asia as well. I mean, we have, I think, still the usual European and Japan, perhaps more reticent, and other countries. Are you seeing a really fundamental shift here? And I guess related to that, are we increasingly, as Canada, isolated?
That's a very good question, Senator. Thank you. Well, if I take one example of the Human Rights Council in China's Universal Periodic Review, I think our sense in counting the numbers is that we're in a smaller and smaller group, willing to speak out and make quite substantive recommendations. I think the number mentioned was 155, but a majority of those statements and questions were softballs, essentially. So in that sense, yes, we're becoming more isolated. But on the positive side, I think we're at a point in China's development history where they're only now coming up against the real constraints of what an international leadership role might look like. And the pushback is starting in some ways in Asia, in ways that I think may have surprised China in some senses. You know, the more obvious ones are related to the Belt and Road Initiative that China's fostering as a means for nominally infrastructure development, but also to urge supply chains and connections with China. There are cases now where some countries having a negative experience with some of these investments, Sri Lanka as one example, are starting to push back in some sectors of those societies with wariness about what the model of governance is that's following these investments. China offers an attractive model of governance in difficult, chaotic times. And if you are a fledgling government, as many in the region are, I was ambassador to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. And after 25 years of dependence, you're still testing out the limits and constraints and the headaches that come with democratic reform, for example. So when China can offer, a state-to-state relationship where the authority of the state is reinforced, perhaps at the expense of the individual's rights, that can be very attractive for some who are dealing for the first time with pushback from their citizens, with demands for greater rights and these sorts of things. And I think that you rightly point out this is an area where we have to be somewhat concerned. The signs, even those places, are that population is wary, that they're also wary of the influence on their own governments and is pushing back on some of these things too. So I'm hopeful that our traditional allies, that we'll be able to find ways to work with other countries who are seeking, another model, who are seeking other partners beyond those who are immediately their immediate neighbors in Asia.
Cut off Senator No on one quick question, so you get the final question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The reason I would like to continue, but I give it the second round. Given China is committing such a clear human rights violations, Uyghur, Tibetans, Falun Gong, and China is the first country persecution of all the world countries combined. Why hasn't Canada established a target sanction, Chinese official?
On the specifics of what sanctions might be available to that, I'd have to defer to my colleagues who deal with that directly. And my understanding is that that's not always an easy decision to take, or always driven by those of us who deal with the bilateral relationship, for example. So difficult for me to answer that. If I could comment a little bit on other policy measures that might be out there, some of which we may consider. Some of you may be aware of the Tibet Reciprocal Tibet Visits Act that was passed in the United States. So the United States passed legislation that would demand reciprocity in terms of visits to the Tibetan region. And there's some success to that. Not long after passing that legislation, the U.S. ambassador was allowed to visit Tibet. I understand a highly scripted visit, but nonetheless, he was able to visit. And there's consideration, I think, amongst others, about what measures you could take to, in that kind of direction. Our position on some of that has been, because of the limited access, because of the limited opportunities to engage in dialogue on these things, when there are visits, as this committee knows, when there are visits from Tibetan authorities in to this country, we have the opportunity, a rare opportunity, to communicate Canada's positions and concerns to those who are directly involved in the administration of the Tibet Autonomous Region. And so that's been our position up to now. From my perspective, you've seen my job title, policy and coordination. We're always looking at what policy options are out there and what we might make a recommendation on. But for the moment, we've stayed on the course of consistency and consistent access and dialogue.
If that's, thank you. If one tiny follow-up. If that's the case, if you say that to policymaking, do you think it's time for Canada to change its position regarding one China policy?
Well, the One China policy is the basis of forming our bilateral relationship, our official diplomatic relationship with China since 1970. And as you may be aware, we take note without endorsing or challenging People's Republic of China's claims on Taiwan. That policy has served us very well in maintaining our relationship with the People's Republic of China, as well as a very active and engaged engagement with Taiwan. So I don't see any revisiting of that policy. As it relates to Tibet, Canada's policy has been that while Tibet represents a very distinct cultural, linguistic, and religious area of China, we have not questioned the People's Republic of China's sovereignty over Tibet.
Thank you.
Mr. Steil, thank you for coming before us. Just one comment on sanctions. I mean, I haven't heard anyone say that we should, at this point, have targeted sanctions against the government of China. But I trust that that is always within assessments. That's your job to do, to determine what are the best moves for the government. But one of the issues are tracing money of those who have violated persistently and consistently human rights in their country can be sanctioned under the Magnitsky Bill. The difficulty is that with China, we can't follow the money or have not taken the steps to follow the money laundering, as it is not as transparent as some other countries where we've been able to identify what happened in the country and where the money went and how Canada ties to it. So that's an area of study and innovation that you might wish to look at. The government's announced that it's going to do more on money laundering and issues of illegal transfers of money. I think we need to do a lot more on that, and then maybe we will have more information. But you have a very large task. I might have misstated your title because it's Greater China Policy and Coordination. I couldn't think of more challenging title and position, and we wish you well in that, and we will certainly want to follow up the successes and the difficulties that you have with this position. Senators,